Hello and welcome back to Franklin Covey's twice weekly podcast on leadership with Scott Miller. I'm your host each week, now 6 years and 400 plus episodes, where every Tuesday and Friday we both curate and release new episodes in both audio and video formats to make you a better leader, designed to make you more highly effective. Of course, Franklin Covey was co-founded 4 decades ago by the seminal thought leader, author, and hero of mine, Dr. Stephen R. Covey. He wrote the seminal book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. This book has gone on to sell nearly 60 million copies around the world, translated, I think, into almost every language, and now Franklin Covey is the most trusted leadership firm in the world. This podcast is fun. It's designed to provide insights and highlight some of the most influential thought leaders in the world. Some weeks they show up as artists, creators, entrepreneurs, solopreneurs, CEOs, advisors, researchers, academics. Some of them are very famous names. Some have authored books, some have not. What they all have in common typically is they've become experts on a singular topic, whether it be through research or practice, or sometimes circumstance, a survival of a tragedy, an enormously challenging life experience where they've researched it and lived to tell about it, to make us all better parents, leaders, friends, and humans. And then there are nuanced scientists, which kind of describe today's guest. She is a renowned strategic advisor to CEOs and leaders around the world. She is a renowned expert in reading facial recognition. She has a graduate degree in cultural anthropology and is an expert on what might be called subconscious leakage. Her name is Annie Sarnblad. She is the author of Diary of a Human Lie Detector. Now, if you have followed this podcast for many years, you know never have I actually post-it noted a book. If you can watch this on video or if you're an audio listener today, the book is absolutely fascinating. We're going to spend the next 40 minutes talking about our facial expressions, our body language, and how that conveys certain emotions, and how as a leader, as a coach, as a parent and friend, you can understand what's really going on, kind of what's the story behind the story. Annie, welcome to On Leadership.
Thanks, Scott. That was a great synopsis, about the best I've heard. So I really appreciate you having me.
Well, you're going to correct a lot of that today. That's very kind of you. What I love to do when we open is have you rewind a little bit, right? Because really your primary role as coach, advisor, and speaker, you speak to business groups around the world. You advise CEOs and boards of directors and business leaders on a variety of issues. Would you maybe rewind a couple of decades, talk about where you got your start, how did this expertise develop, and how do you spend most of your time today? Not today particularly, but in 2024 and beyond, and then we'll dive into some of the fascinating insights in your book, Diary of a Human Lie Detector.
Yeah, so I'll try to do the quick synopsis. I ran away from home when I was 16 years old, and the way I ran away from home was I got a Rotary exchange scholarship to go to Sweden. And things were not easy at home, and I wanted to explore other cultures, and really I wanted another family to adopt me. And so I went to Sweden when I was 16, stayed there for half a year, and then ended up moving back there when I was finished with high school to do all my university studies. I have lived in 9 countries over a period, including the US, over a period of about 25 years. I was outside of the country, outside of the US. So I was gone more or less from the age of 16 to 40, with a couple of exceptions. I spent a good chunk of that time in Asia and a lot of time in Sweden and other countries in Europe. So I started my career first in private equity in Asia, moved to Stockholm, worked as a management consultant for a few years. I was the only person at that time in this company of 150 people that had English as my mother tongue. So I was able to jump from, I was hired as a strategy consultant, and then I went on to do communication, change management, marketing. I was able to do any sort of big project that was working directly with CEOs, where the CEO had to present all of his work in English, because it was right about that time in the 90s where all of the companies in Northern Europe were merging and going over to start having English as their company-wide language. And so I got a really good start, and from there, dealt with a lot of complexities of people in power and realized very quickly that I could be the confidant to somebody who was lonely, somewhat frustrated, professionally isolated, and couldn't tell their board what they were struggling with, couldn't tell their employees, and didn't have colleagues. Now, a lot of my clients have membership groups that they belong to, like YPO or Tiger 21, where they actually have colleagues that can tell them what's going on so they can discuss their complex business issues. But back in the day, I really felt like I was privileged to get the whole scoop on some of these issues. And from there, I went on to start my business and work directly with CEOs, managing directors, and boards. And I kept my ability to code facial expressions the secret. I spent all this time learning different languages. I've studied 8 languages through immersion, and I got really good at simplifying and translating words and ideas. And from there, I did a coding certification called facial action coding, which was started by Paul Ekman and some of his colleagues back in the 70s to take the 10,000 different muscle combinations in human expression, simplify them into action units, and then be able to code any facial expression on any human, do a numerical and alphabetical coding, send it to another coder, and they could take and recreate the facial expression to the exact degree without actually looking at any visual of a face, just the coding itself. I was obsessed with teaching my children to recognize predatory behavior. So I took the entire field of science and revamped it, simplified it, and used it to teach my own children with the idea of, if this is the universal language of our species, so the universal nonverbal language of our species, it must be a teachable skill. If babies know it up until about the age of 2, it must be something that I can reintroduce to my children. And in fact, I could. So I took that simplified, the simplified field of science, and I kept it only in my family until about 2012, when I moved back to the US after living in Asia for over a decade. And I couldn't get a job as a strategic advisor because I had built my network first in Asia and Europe. And so I actually started telling people that I could not only read microexpressions, but I could teach them fairly quickly. And that got me involved with the Museum of Science and Young Presidents Organization, which I've done over 50 events for YPO. And it really started from there. And so today I do about 50% of my work. I do strategic advisory and coaching on a really high level. I work with a lot of family offices and corporations, sometimes one and the same. And I work with their most complex people problems.
This is going to be a 4-hour podcast because I am the father to 3 young boys that are 10, 12, and 14. And I would love to talk about how they can identify predatory behavior. We can take that offline. You describe microexpressions as subconscious leakage of emotions. Why does a leader of people need to have some working knowledge or expertise, maybe not expertise, but a functional knowledge of their own facial expressions and perhaps that of others on their team?
Yeah, I think one of the things that probably most people listening to this podcast know, but a lot of people don't know, is that, again, leading an organization is a lot of pressure and very, very isolated. As you rise in power, you get less and less information about what's actually going on around you, because when you have a lot of power, people try to please you and they want to be in your good graces. So they laugh at your jokes. They tell you your ideas are great. It becomes more and more important to see people's true intentions. And the beautiful thing about microexpressions is that there is no filter. They precede the thought process. They're involuntary. I can't stop myself from making certain microexpressions, even if I try, because they leak before the thought process is finished. And so for a leader to understand the true emotions and intentions of the people going around them, whether it's negotiating a really high stakes deal, or whether it's figuring out if your business partners are actually in alignment with you, or simply if your employee is going to actually be able to implement the project that they're in charge of. Those are all things that are crucial to recognize.
Annie, I'm going to bounce around about 6 or 7 different topics in your book, Diary of a Human Lie Detector, who, by the way, you use yourself as a little bit of a guinea pig by showing hundreds or maybe dozens at least of photos of different facial expressions and micro expressions. Let's talk about origin story and holding back. You mentioned that holding back is the facial expression that puffs out the skin under the lower lip. You can talk more about that. And you see this often in meetings or in situations where people don't feel comfortable sharing, and you've also followed up with them. And it's a great insight for leaders, right, to understand when do they have buy-in, when does someone feel safe, when does someone feel like they have, they belong to a group. Riff on that for leaders, if you will.
Yep. So I always talk about Barack Obama being the king of suppression because he makes this facial expression. When I teach, when I'm going out and teaching, I use facial expressions of politicians and celebrities because facial expressions that on people that we recognize stick better. It's anchoring that idea. It's a teaching tool. I was about 6 months away from getting a teaching degree when I switched over to anthropology. So that's always been an obsession of mine. Barack Obama, if you can think about it, was often in a situation where he wanted to say more than he thought was a good idea to say. And so he'd make this facial expression. It's that puff. It's like a bubble of skin that pushes out right under the lip. And it can be combined with other emotions like anger or sadness or concentration. But anytime you see that bubble, it's like some of the Scandinavians and actually people in America too, when they do that tobacco that they tuck in between their lower lip and their teeth,
Chewing
bubbles
tobacco.
out like that.
Yeah.
And Caitlin Clark has been making that a lot lately when she's getting these interviews where she has more to say and she doesn't seemingly want to veer off into that topic. And so it's the grown-up version of biting your tongue, or kind of, I think I have a picture in the book where someone's covering their mouth. You know, little kids will, when they want to say something and they're trying not to tell you a secret, they'll go like this and cover their mouth. It is that, like, I am so itching to tell you this. So if you see it, for example, in a meeting or in a boardroom, and you approach the person who was making that expression later and you say, hey, what did you think about X? Or when this strategy came up, I saw that you had a reaction. What do you think about that? They will almost vomit it all over you because there's such a desire to talk about it. They had to hold themselves back and restrain themselves from saying it. So if you give them the opportunity, they'll tell you what's going on. And sometimes it's just that, like, this project is not going to be completed according to the timeline because the technology is not working.
You know, when I was reading your book, I was further convinced of my militant stand on when you're on a Zoom or a Teams or a Google Meet meeting, I need you on camera. Like, you need to be on camera. Not on a phone call. I need you on camera so that I can understand, do we have buy-in? Am I being received as credible? Do you believe what it is you and I are saying? Is there pushback? I think it's so important now, where so much business is happening virtually, if you will, to have people on camera. And there still is a segment of society that's strongly pushing back on this. I will choose whether to be on camera. And I think, no, if you're working, I feel like if you're working, then you ought to be able to come on camera. Maybe call me old school, but I think it's important for building trust, for building mutual respect, for understanding how you are feeling, and does my delivery need to change? Riff on that, including if you disagree with me.
Yeah, I do kind of disagree. So what I do is, initially when I meet somebody, I'd love to be on camera. So this would be hard to do for me if we were just having the phone call, at least if it was being recorded. So I like to see the person's face. The problem with Zoom and camera is that people are often doing, I'm going to give you an example. They're looking at themselves, and then they're kind of like, oh, my hair is doing this, and oh my. So you're not necessarily getting the facial expressions that are in response to what you're doing and you're saying, because there's just too much navel gazing going on in the world, and it's very hard for us, unless we turn off our own picture, to respond only to the other person. So my preference when I'm talking to clients and I'm coaching clients and I know them well, first of all, my preference is to meet a person because that's super important. A second, it would be Zoom for an early meeting. But once the relationship is established, my preference is to just do an old school call because I'm less distracted by looking at my own image.
Well, maybe I just have less narcissism than you do because I don't care
You
about
might
how I
be.
look. I'm
That
kidding.
is
I'm
entirely
kidding.
possible.
But hopefully people are laughing right now. Okay, let's talk about vulnerability and how that manifests in the face and in your facial micro expressions, because I would think we as leaders would want to both be received as being vulnerable, but also pick up on that in someone else in the hopes it might be a tender moment or some feedback or something they don't feel safe sharing. Riff on that.
So good leaders, yes, good leaders are comfortable with vulnerability. Did you see it? I just did that. But I'm going to say something that makes me feel a little vulnerable because I don't want people to be called out that I know. But bad leaders are not. It's quite simply bad leaders cannot show vulnerability, are always trying to show that they're good at everything. They can't show their humanity or their humility. And that's a problem because it's not authentic, it's not real. People can smell it, they can see it, they can hear it. You saw when you first just talked about vulnerability, I immediately swallowed. And you can see that my clients, politicians do that all the time. I've been coding the debates, and both presidential candidates and VP candidates do a lot of that swallowing, or when they get a question that's uncomfortable or they feel particularly targeted, they pucker their chin. So our achy breaky heart is on our chin. That's a piece of sadness, romantic love, and empathy, which all makes sense because vulnerability is a piece of each of those emotions. Anytime there is a possibility of a loss, vulnerability will show on our chins. And you can see the difference. That's the little chin pucker of vulnerability. And again, I have a hard time going right into suppression, but suppression is this bubble. That puckers the chin as well, but it moves so many muscles together. So it's almost, the chin puckering is necessary. The suppression is almost always a macro expression because it takes so much to make it. So yes, vulnerability is extraordinarily important, and I would go so far as to say it's a piece of every human connection, whether it's business or professional, business, professional, personal, or romantic.
For those who are listening to today's podcast on audio, you might want to actually watch this on video because Annie isn't just an expert in these facial expressions. She actually uses dozens of them in her book and is demonstrating them on the camera today. Let's talk a little bit about early in life. You mentioned a great story around how the best friends are the friends that we had in elementary school because we weren't trying to be someone else or pretend who we were. Rewind a little bit, because that was a very tender story and reminder about how much of our behavior becomes managed and contrived and orchestrated. And it's kind of like we're always in battle with how we're feeling, what we're thinking, what we're saying, and how our body betrays us or aligns with that. It's a struggle if you actually become pretty self-aware about all these pieces working against each other.
Yeah. So to answer the first piece of that, I think the beauty of being a child is this piece of you can't hide it. You just are who you are, and even if you are trying to adjust your behavior, I had some trauma in my family, and I was an expert at adjusting my mood to accommodate other people's moods. And yet I still was very much authentically myself because I didn't know how to do anything else. I became quite the chameleon as I got older and I traveled and I assimilated into other cultures, that I got to be an expert at showing those pieces of myself that aligned with the language and the culture of the place I was visiting or living. And I realized after much therapy that wasn't actually a healthy thing, that everywhere I went, if I was living in Switzerland, the Swiss would say, oh, but you're one of us. You're more or less like a local. The Swedes always claimed me as Swedes. Even when I was living in Singapore, my Singaporean friends would say, yeah, but you're local. You're at least much more Asian than most of the expats in the expat community. And there are pieces of everywhere I have lived that I have deeply, deeply loved and deeply respected. But I also realized that I lost a good piece of my authentic self when I was living abroad for, again, 2.5 decades. And so I think moving back to the US and reclaiming my roots, and I do have a lot of friends that are my elementary school friends that I have kept and reestablished those deep, deep relationships. And that has made me feel whole in a way that other people can't quite reach.
Annie, speaking of many cultures, I'm guessing you have some ability to determine if someone is French or Taiwanese, not by looking at them from their maybe ethnicity, but from the way their facial features move because of the way different words are pronounced and our micro-expressions. Talk a little bit about how language also betrays your
I'm going to try not to draw on my face, and I'm going to lean forward. The Swiss and the French in particular, när jag pratar svenska så ser du rynkorna här. When I speak Swedish, you see those wrinkles?
Yeah.
That's because I pucker my mouth. C'est la même chose quand je parle en français, hein? It gets these wrinkles, and it's almost the same as an American who has been smoking. And I see it in particular with women who have generally thinner skin, and I'm not saying this in a figurative way. I'm saying literally they have thinner skin on their face, and so they tend to get these really fine lines if they speak French or Swedish or a similar language that uses that like lip pucker when they're speaking. So I can often see of the languages that I know, if you just show me someone's face, especially if they're in their 60s, 70s, 80s and up, where their wrinkles are, I can see which facial expressions they've done, both to pronounce the words in their language, as well as you can see, like if somebody has deep lines here, but you see with my wrinkles, they go all the way down. That's because I've shown some disgust, and disgust makes that, that in Swedish we call it förakt. It's that like looking down your nose someone, and you get deep wrinkles right here, whereas if you're really happy, you show the wrinkles out here. So I can look at somebody's baseline if they haven't had cosmetic surgery, Botox, and fillers, and see which facial expressions they've made, both from language and from the actual feelings, over and over, because it gets etched into their skin. So that gives me, if I'm dealing with a 60-year-old man, I can approach him at a cocktail party and see, okay, this is his level of grumpiness over his lifetime. And that gives me information about how to approach.
Other than being riveting and great cocktail party conversation with those you trust, why would leaders or parents or interested human beings in relationships want to spend some time to maybe not become an expert, but to accurately assess what's going on with someone's facial expressions? Or could that become an obsession and you are constantly trying to analyze people, maybe you're getting it right or wrong? Like, what's the healthy middle balance for a guy like me who has enough knowledge to be dangerous but not enough to be insightful, or maybe not enough to be dismissive or wrong, or maybe even prejudiced against someone or something?
I'm seeing it as putting words on the red flags. When you get a gut response, which is a reaction like, I don't trust this person, it gives you that confirmation. So if someone is saying to you, watch my face, right next to my nose, for those of you that are listening and not watching, I'm actually doing the growl like a dog does. And that's this facial expression. This is the macro where I'm going, if I'm leaning forward and I'm saying, Scott, I was so glad to hear about your promotion, and I'm growling at you, that's a problem. And my body is betraying me. So the micro expression is just that little bad bunny rabbit twitch next to the nostril, one or both nostrils. Usually the micro expression is just on one side. You can just see that little flicker. And if you know where to look, it's almost impossible to miss, but you actually have to dip your gaze when you're asking or talking about something important to see that micro expression. So you're prepared ahead of time because it's going to go so fast. So if you want to know the intentions of the people around you, whether you're going to leave your children with them, whether or not your kid is having problems with a teacher or with some kind of authority figure in their lives, it gives you this really clear information about a red flag. It tells you only what someone is feeling and not what they're thinking. So it's really, really important to withhold judgment. But if I'm going to put somebody in charge of picking up my kids after school and there's something that is a red flag, I'm going to choose somebody else. I'm not going to take that risk with my children and maybe with my, or with my money, with my investments.
So we don't have enough time to talk deeply about this, but I would like to revisit that as a parent. What tips might you give parents or grandparents, given that they're all novices like me? Maybe they'll read your book and become a little more sophisticated in the topic. How do you tell predatory behavior or behavior that is such that you would not want that person responsible for or in the presence alone with your children? What can you tell us about that?
Okay, so first of all, I do some work. I actually tried to get out of it, and then I had a couple of really high-powered public figure families in the U.S. approach me and beg me to get back into it. So I take on a very, very few clients where I teach their children. If there's a kidnapping risk for the kids, I will work with the parents and the kids. I never teach just the children. They have to have a shared vocabulary with their parents. And so the simple answer to that is I teach them to look for when the facial expressions don't match the words. So for example, if somebody's raising their informal triangles, their cheeks in pleasure, and they're saying, I'm so sorry to see that you're hurt, that's a problem. Or if somebody's saying, I'm so glad to see you today, and they're growling again, that's a problem. But if somebody says, yay, you got a good score on your test, or I'm so happy that you recovered from the flu, that's fine. So we're looking at the two extremes because we need to, as humans, especially as small, vulnerable humans, recognize both who's a predator, and also if you're living in the public eye or you through no fault of your own, have parents that are constantly living in the public eye, which is both a blessing and a burden. You also need to understand who you can trust. Who are those people that genuinely love you, that don't care about your status, your wealth, your parents' connections? Who can you trust? Because without that deep connection to other humans, we struggle in life. We need love and safety, and we need to know who we can trust and who we can't trust. And if there's somebody that they can't trust, they need to be able to sound the alarm to a grown-up who's going to listen.
Annie, you also did some writing and work on men and women and how you've learned to work with men in leadership roles and power roles versus women. Talk about that as we conclude our conversation.
Yeah, so the interesting thing that I discovered sort of through therapy, I've always known that I have a knack for working with incredibly powerful men. And one, I think it comes from my deep reluctance to see anybody as below or above me in terms of hierarchy. I just see humans as humans. And so I find powerful men fun to banter with because I have this tendency to want to take them down a peg and kind of poke at them. And once I do that, they say, oh, okay, we're on the same level and I can actually be vulnerable. You're not going to judge me for my humanity or for the things that I'm struggling with. That comes from trauma from my father. I had an abusive dad as a child, and I think I deeply found a sense of safety in being able to manage people that are in very powerful positions. So I don't think it comes from a healthy place, but it's incredibly enjoyable for me to solve really, really complex problems with people who aren't willing to discuss those problems with other people. So I see that as a blessing and a privilege for the most part. Women, I have spent the last few years really focusing on getting my work and my ability to recognize true intentions so that I can teach them to young women. That's really why I published my diary, because I wanted to give them the truth. Young women in particular are only interested in the truth. And I want them to be able to make better, healthier, safer choices when it comes to professional relationships, friendships, and romantic relationships. Oftentimes, women in particular will say, I knew it when I met him that something was off, whether it's their boss or a colleague or somebody that they've opened up and allowed into their lives, either personally or professionally. I'm finding more and more young men that are approaching me and interested in my work because, of course, it's such an essential piece for them, too, in finding out who they can trust also in romantic relationships. If you're interested in something real in your professional life or in your personal life, it helps to know somebody's intention. So for example, for people who are dating, both men and women, if you're looking for something real, you're going to look and watch if that person is ever showing empathy on their chin in response to you talking about something difficult or hard. If they never show empathy on their chin, they're not, if I tell you a loved one is in the hospital and I don't see you at least some of the time puckering your chin, if we have a close, intimate relationship, that's going to be a problem because you're not showing any emotion or any investment in my feelings. And so that person may be very attracted to you, but if you're looking for something real, you don't want just the attraction romantically. You want somebody who's emotionally attached. And I would go so far as to say that's essential for business too, to see that this person actually cares about me. It's somebody that I can trust business-wise as well. That's a little bit more nuanced, but it's still an important piece to feel like you can trust somebody.
I'm kind of paralyzed. The courage it must take to be your friend and meet you at a coffee shop over a small table. Oh my gosh.
I get that sometimes, but
sometimes. Sometimes.
No, the funny thing is that people will say, it's just such a relief to not have to pretend. Or people will assume, I get a lot of my clients who say, well, you can see everything anyways, and they somehow attribute me to being like a mind reader. I can just see if you're upset or if you're angry or if you're feeling confused or if you're thinking, like I can see all the emotions, but I don't know why unless you tell me or unless I do, some digging or I ask, I continue to ask questions. So there is this surrender that comes with being both my friend and my client where people say, it's actually just a relief. I can come in and I can just be exactly, and I'll tell you everything that's wrong or everything that's right. And when I'm training them in micro expressions, they actually get to the point where they're like, oh, you really care about me, don't you?
Oh, cultural anthropologist, the loneliest woman on the planet because no one will have lunch with her. I would be so horrified thinking you were psychoanalyzing me. Annie Sarnblad, it's been a delight to listen to you today. You are a cultural anthropologist, an expert on reading human facial expressions and a strategic advisor to many leaders around the world. Your book is Diary of a Human Lie Detector, a book I will never let my wife get her hands on for fear I will be exposed as more of a fraud than she's convinced I am. Thank you for joining us today. You're a delight.
Thanks, Scott. It's been my pleasure.
And we'll see you back here next week for a new conversation on leadership.